Hello, and welcome to En route, the podcast where we talk about life along the way. I'm Dennis Sanders, your host. Have you subscribed to the show yet? If you have, thank you very much. If you haven't, well, what are you waiting for? Subscribe. You can subscribe to the show in Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or via RSS, and you will never miss a show when you do that. And don't just listen to the show. Leave a review on whatever platform you listen to this podcast. When you do that, that helps the algorithms and allows this podcast to be easier to find so that people can also listen to this great podcast. And two other things. En route does have a YouTube channel, so if you like to listen to a podcast on YouTube, check out the show notes for the link and then subscribe. And also, I want to let you know we do have another podcast, or I do have another podcast. It's called Little Jaunts. It is right now some of the highlights from past episodes. We do maybe short snippets of it, so it's basically 15 minutes or less. We have one that's recently on Afghanistan, another one on the coronavirus, and there is a two-parter that I definitely would like people to listen to on what really happened to Sears. What happened to Sears is not what you think. It was not decimated because of Amazon. There is another reason, and you'll find out when you listen to the podcast. So please, there is a link how you can find Little Jaunts and subscribe, and it is available on all the same platforms that En route is found on. Well, for today's episode, we are talking about Afghanistan, and we have all seen the images. We saw that massive C-17 cargo plane as it was making its way down a runway at the airport in Kabul, and we saw that all of these people that were running with the plane, and there were even some that were clinging to the side of the plane, all of these people were desperate to get out of the country. They wanted to escape the horrors of the Taliban, which basically had swept into power only a day or so earlier. There were some that were so desperate that they clung to the plane even as it took off. And we saw those pictures of people falling to their deaths. Everyone is in some way surprised at how fast the Taliban swept into Kabul. Many of us thought it would be months before that could happen. And now it has. The government of Afghanistan has collapsed. The new leaders of the newly christened Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan are settling in. And many people throughout the country worry about going back to the bad old days when the Taliban ruled from 1996 until 2001. So, what is going to happen in Afghanistan? What will happen to the progress that was made by women? And now that we are in the process of leaving Afghanistan, is the world safer or not? And do Americans really care? To answer those questions, I spoke today with Paul Miller. Miller is a professor of the practice of international affairs at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. Before that, he served on the National Security Council staff under both President George W. Bush and Barack Obama. I talked to him, one, because he is an expert on Afghanistan, and trying to talk about why the withdrawal happened the way that it did and how this change with the Taliban back in power, how this might harm the world order that was created after World War II. So, let's hear now from Paul Miller. Well, Paul, thank you for joining me this morning. I know that you are pretty busy and pretty high demand these days.
Thanks for having me on the show.
Well, the first question is kind of a basic one. Can you kind of tell me what you think is the overall situation in Afghanistan right now? I know that there are still U.S. troops at the airport. They are still trying to get people out, but you know, are there still Americans that are still not able to get to the airport? And how are we trying to get them out and other Afghans?
So the Taliban have won the war. They've taken Kabul. They control the country. I've heard various numbers of how many Americans and Afghan allies have been left behind. My understanding is somewhere between 10,000 and 15,000 Americans may be in country, and somewhere upwards of 100,000 Afghan refugees are also seeking evacuation from Afghanistan. It's a dire humanitarian situation, and I'm sad to say it's a crisis of our own making by withdrawing the way we did. But that's the situation as I understand it right now.
It doesn't seem like we really planned for this evacuation. I mean, that there are tens of thousands of our own citizens, and then at least 100,000 of Afghans that we knew that this was coming. Why did we not plan for this?
That's a great question, and I kind of wish I knew. I think that the poor planning is just one of the largest, most shocking derelictions of duty I've seen in my lifetime. I think that after President Trump signed the peace deal with the Taliban in February of 2020, that should have been the starting clock, where the U.S. government focused on nothing else in Afghanistan other than planning for these evacuations, getting out all the American citizens, making a priority list of the Afghans who worked with us over the years, who applied for the Special Immigrant Visa Program, the SIV program, and then, of course, planning for the military evacuation as well. It's evident that didn't happen under the Trump administration. Biden then inherits this. He decides to go ahead and keep the peace deal, which by itself I think is inexplicable. But I think he made a key mistake by announcing in April his intent to complete the withdrawal before the plans were in place for the evacuation. It's pretty clear that he announced our intent to withdraw, and then panic set in over the next couple of months, particularly the last few weeks. Panic amongst American citizens and amongst the Afghan allies. So yes, it's a complete lack of planning. It's an international public humiliation for the United States to have this kind of scene unfold at the very end of our 20-year conflict there.
One of the things that we hear from some people, especially who were not in favor of us being in Afghanistan, is that this won't have any effect on, let's say, any type of conflict with Taiwan or the Baltic states. Do you see a connection, or are they just kind of blowing smoke when they say that?
So there's two ways of making that argument. There's the kind of cheap and easy way, which says our allies will lose confidence, our enemies will gain confidence, and World War III is coming. Okay, that kind of overstates it a bit. Let me say it a different way, and I put this in an article I wrote for the Dispatch just yesterday. The fall of Kabul is not the most important geopolitical event in the world, but it is one more step along a path that we've been walking for 20 or 30 years. The path is the descent of world order, the erosion of the free world, and the rise of authoritarianism as an alternate organizing principle for world order. I don't like that world. I don't like that path we're on. And if we continue on this path, I see where it leads. It leads to greater anarchy, more violence, more misery for everyone, and possibly more violent competition on the international stage.
And I did read that article in the Dispatch, and it was quite chilling. Why do you think that we have it? It just seems like within our government, and especially in our foreign policy and military establishments, people aren't seeing that. They don't see this as a big deal. They don't see a worry about the decline of the international order. What is causing that kind of sense of blindness, do you think?
What's interesting is that the Biden administration claimed to see it that way before they came into office. Candidate Biden, he talked about reviving the democratic agenda and reviving the democratic world, bringing the free nations back together. He's actually going to host later this year a democracy summit. And they're talking about forming a D10, the leading 10 democratic powers of the world. And I support all that. I think it's fantastic. It seems that Biden never saw the connection between that and what's going on in Afghanistan. Even in his speech this last Monday, where he talked about Afghanistan, he said, I want human rights to be the centerpiece of my foreign policy. My response is, how are you going to do that when you're allowing women to go back under Taliban rule? That's the greatest reversal of human rights we've seen in a decade. How did we get here? We got here because we're in the middle of, well, maybe the middle, maybe the tail end, maybe the beginning of a upsurge of nationalism and populism around the world. And in the United States, we saw that in the person of Donald Trump. And it's not just Trump, it is the Republican Party as a whole, right? They now embody a kind of a nationalist approach to the world. And Trump said very plainly that he doesn't think it's important to spread democracy at all. He said that on the campaign trail throughout his presidency. He said he just didn't care. He doesn't think that it's important or valuable to put our thumb on the scale in favor of democracy on the global stage. I think, to be fair, Mike Pompeo disagrees. The Secretary of State, he disagreed, but Trump was the decider, and he said it doesn't matter to him. So when you have, for a half a decade, the president and candidate Trump saying this repeatedly, he's really changed the thinking of the Republican Party. Remember the last Republican president, George Bush, was criticized for how utopian his vision was in spreading democracy around the world. So the Republican Party's done just an abrupt about face on this. And so Americans, at least half Americans, are deeply pessimistic and uninterested in democracy promotion. And the Democratic Party, they seem to like the rhetoric, but when it came time to kind of put their money where their mouth is in Afghanistan, they were happy to support Biden and run. And so that's where we are.
It seems, especially, I mean, within the Democratic Party, there is a kind of a movement, at least within there, that's a kind of America can't really do anything good. That the only thing we can do is just stick to our own. As well as what you're talking about with the Republican Party, that there is really kind of almost on both sides, kind of a neo-isolationism that seems to be setting in.
Yeah, I think some people call it the horseshoe theory of politics, where the extremes on both ends end up resembling each other. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. I think the nationalist right and the kind of the extreme progressive left end up viewing America the same way, as kind of hopelessly corrupt, right? And their solutions are very different. The nationalists, they want to go back to this imagined mythical vision of 1950s America, which never existed. And the progressives want to do something else, their progressive utopia. But their analysis of America on the world stage is also kind of similar, right? They both agree that we shouldn't or can't stand for ideals on the world stage. I'm going to use a word here that some people don't like. It's American exceptionalism, right? And there's lots of different versions of American exceptionalism. There's the bad kind, that we're exceptionally righteous and innocent, and that's just stupid. We all know that. But there's the good kind of American exceptionalism that says we ought to hold ourselves to high ideals and try to strive to live up and be an example of liberty and justice for all people. And that I agree with that. I believe in that. President Bush said something like this. He said, look, these ideals of freedom and equality, they're not ours. They don't belong to us. But he says, no nation owns them and no nation is exempt from them. I think that's a good way of thinking about it. And the United States has a unique role to play, not because we're uniquely moral. We're certainly not that, but because we are uniquely powerful still. And to him who's been given much, from him much will be expected, right? Or Spider-Man, like with great power comes great responsibility. So like we've got this power, we better do something with it. And that means we ought to stand for something. And that's what I believe should be true domestically and internationally. Ordered liberty at home and abroad.
Well, related to the belief that we haven't done anything, I was fascinated. There was an article that Jonathan Rauch wrote kind of about seeing some of the successes that happened. And he shares something from the Brookings. Infant mortality has dropped in half during the U.S. operation. Life expectancy improved by 6 years. Electricity consumption has increased. Years in school have increased from 3 years to 4. university graduates have rose from 31,000 to 200,000. Of course, we know everything that's happened with the role of women. All of that has, I mean, we don't hear that very much. In fact, in most of the 20 years, I don't think we've ever heard that. And I think this is a question of why haven't we heard that from the government? And especially also, why haven't we heard that from the media?
Yeah. Yeah, it's true that the United States, that Afghanistan over the past 20 years had a chapter in its history that on retrospect will look better than we thought it was. You're right. All the metrics of human development improved, and the Afghan economy grew, and girls were in school. Most importantly, a generation of Afghans grew up being able to say what they believed and write what they wanted to write, and again, go to school and believe what they want to believe within bounds. But it was relative freedom, certainly compared to the Taliban and the Soviets. It's the most free Afghanistan's been perhaps ever. And that's a real achievement, and we should be proud of that. Although we should also recognize it's all now going to be undone quite rapidly. Why haven't we heard about it? Partly because the media is just bad news stories get more clicks, right? And also because of this curious dynamic. The government, and I served in the government for 10 years, is almost reflexively optimistic, right? If you ask a bureaucrat, how's it going? He's going to say, well, progress made, challenges remain. That was actually a joke we had in government, right? That's always the headline. There are challenges, but we're making progress. There's actually some truth to that. It's true in Afghanistan. We were making some slow and fitful progress. The media then reflexively looks how to criticize that, right? They just automatically look, how can I essentially disprove that story or tear it down or deconstruct it? That's just what the media thinks its job is. So that's the dynamic. Government says a good thing, media says a bad thing. And that's why we hear the bad stuff all the time.
Another article that I thought was fascinating and in some ways shocking was there's been some articles, of course, many things written by Matt Iglesias. And his take on this was basically that there's a free rider problem with America, in that we're kind of the big nation and we're providing security for all of these countries in Europe and in Asia. And basically they should pick up some of the bill. They should be able to fend a little bit more for themselves. And in fact, he says something to the effect of, don't be Afghanistan, which is basically a way of saying that Afghanistan didn't really step up. Again, I mean, we just kind of talked about the horseshoe theory. What do you think about that? And do you think that belief is rife within our government or in our kind of among our elite?
The burden sharing problem is real, and the free riding, the moral hazard is real. Presidents for 70 years have been berating our NATO allies to invest more in their defense capabilities. Trump wasn't the first one, and Trump was right to do so, just not publicly. So all that is true. I would not really put Afghanistan in that category. Our allies should pay up, according to their capability. And of course, Afghanistan is basically the most poorest country in the world, and they didn't have the ability to invest much. I want to address specifically the Afghan army, because President Biden said in his speech, the army didn't fight, and if they're not going to fight for the country, we shouldn't. And that is a real, it's a lie, and it's an insult to the Afghans, because the Afghan army did fight. It fought for 10 years. It stood the line, held the line against the Taliban for 10 years, and 55,000 Afghan soldiers died in combat against our enemies. So for the president to say they're not pulling their weight I just cannot believe how irresponsible, how unpresidential it was for him to say that. So yes, we should do appropriate burden sharing with our allies. That's not really what the problem was in Afghanistan.
What was the problem then?
The Afghan army collapsed because they lost their morale when we announced we're leaving. The Afghan soldiers, they could fight on the ground with very little American help on the ground, but they needed the American Air Force, right? That's kind of the main thing we were providing them, was close air support, medevac, logistics, intel, that kind of stuff. And that's precisely what Biden pulled the plug on starting in April. And the Afghan soldiers, they made a very rational decision. Look, if we're going to lose the support that was helping us win the battles, we're going home, right? I'm not going to commit suicide by I'm not going to go on a suicide mission. So I'm out of here. I'm going to go hang out with my family. Maybe I can hop on a plane and escape the country. But they all knew what was coming when we told them we're no longer giving you what you need to win the fight. And so who's to blame for that? Is it the Afghans for making the decision, or is it Biden for pulling the rug out from under their feet?
What do you think is going to happen related to terrorism? I mean, we know that Al Qaeda actually still has a presence there, and we also know that basically now we're not there. And of course, Afghanistan's a landlocked country. It would be hard for us to do any type of flights or drones or things unless we get permission from other countries.
That's right.
And most of those countries are not necessarily we're having the best of relations. So what happens? I mean, how do we protect ourselves? I mean, we had not had a major terrorist attack in 20 years. So how do we protect ourselves?
Yeah. And I think, by the way, that's another success we should claim and be proud of. For 20 years, Al-Qaeda and their other jihadist copycats and other groups, they were on the run. They were hiding. They spent all of their energy making sure to avoid our drones, our special forces, our airstrikes. So they didn't have time or space to plan other terrorist attacks. Now they do. And the Pentagon, I think the intelligence community has publicly said, yeah, Al-Qaeda is going to come back. Al-Qaeda is going to reconstitute its presence in Afghanistan and Western Pakistan. They will be able to recruit, train, fundraise, and plan, which is exactly what they couldn't do for the past 20 years. That means, I think, it's sad to say, it's kind of scary to say, we are all now at heightened risk of international terrorism. When I say we all, I mean, it's not just the United States, it's Europe, it's our allies overseas, it's maybe military bases overseas. I'm not quite sure if, when, and where Al-Qaeda might attack, but I think that they will try again because that's what they do. And it's kind of scary. Now, the good news is our homeland security is much better than it used to be. And let's take some comfort from that. Our defense is better. Our offense is worse. The international environment is worse than it was in 2001, but our homeland security is better. Where's the balance there? Are we going to see another island? I don't know. I hope that we are able to defend ourselves. I also hope that the international community recognizes the common danger and is ready to do something about it if there's another opportunity. Okay, what am I getting at here? We withdrew from Iraq in 2011. We were right back in Iraq in 2014 because the Islamic State arose, chopped a few people's heads off, and it was just obvious. The entire world knew that we had to do. We couldn't let them sweep across Iraq and Syria and conquer two states and become a terrorist nation. We just couldn't allow that. Could something similar happen in Afghanistan? Absolutely. Absolutely. Just watch to see what the Taliban does, watch to see what Al-Qaeda does, what the Islamic State does. And if something dramatic happens, if, look, I hate to say it, but look, if Al-Qaeda attacks the Kabul airport while the evacuations are underway, that could trigger a pretty severe international response and maybe another kind of international intervention. Not the same kind of intervention we had, but maybe a short, sharp, punitive strike to kind of wipe out as many terrorists as we can on the way out. I could envision something like that happen either now or 3 years from now. And we might really see that.
When it comes to the looking back at history, one of the other things that people will tend to say is that maybe it would have been better had we attacked in 2001, were able to take out Osama bin Laden and maybe Mullah Omar, the head of the Taliban then, and then leave. And that would have been better than what we ended up doing. I've heard arguments in favor of that. I've heard arguments against that. Where would you stand?
So if we had undertaken a punitive strike, dropping a few bombs, maybe some special forces and leaving, that's mowing the lawn. It grows right back. It's playing whack-a-mole, right? You hit them now, they come right back up later on, a few provinces over. If we just dropped bombs on Al-Qaeda and left, they would come back. The Taliban would come back. So long as the Taliban's in control of Afghanistan, jihadists from around the world will be able to find some degree of safe haven there. To be clear, I do think it'll be a less overt safe haven than it used to be. The Taliban is not going to advertise it, but it's very clear that they're friendly to jihadist groups. And so again, in 2001, drop a few bombs, go home, they're going to come right back. And we knew that at the time. The strategic logic is so obvious and clear. That's precisely why President Bush understood. And he said, we need to stay. And he said in a speech in April 2002, he said, true peace will come only when we equip the Afghans to provide their own peace, their own governance, their own security. And he understood that logic, and he was correct. We failed. We never did that. We actually were unable to achieve those lasting conditions of peace and security. And now Al-Qaeda is going to come back.
Why do you think we failed? Why does it seem that we weren't able to do that? Was it a lack of will or a lack of focus?
Yeah. Historians will be answering that question forever, right? They'll be writing books and shelves of books on this stuff, including me. I'm going to write my own book on this. So I'll give you 4 decision points where I think we got things wrong. First was President Bush's decision very early on to adopt a light footprint in Afghanistan. I think maybe most people don't know this because it's been so long, but we went in with very few troops. And we spent all of our time whacking a few terrorists, and we didn't do a whole lot to rebuild Afghanistan for the first 5 or 6 years. We had a light military footprint and also a light reconstruction footprint. We didn't spend a lot of money trying to rebuild Afghanistan in those first few years. Why is that a bad decision? Because we allowed a vacuum of authority to arise or to exist throughout almost all of Afghanistan. Kabul was secure and Kabul was under the control of the Afghan government, but the rest of the country was kind of still a failed state. And nature abhors a vacuum. The Taliban had not been defeated. They were hiding in Pakistan. They saw the vacuum of authority. They're like, hey, we're coming back. Nobody's stopping us. There's nothing to stop us from walking into Kandahar and announcing our presence and coming back, which is what they did starting in about 2005. And the Taliban insurgency starts from there. So that was for the first bad decision, was light footprint leads to the Taliban resurgence. Second bad decision was President Obama, his withdrawal deadlines, his withdrawal timetable. He comes into office and he promises to win the war, which is great. He does a surge, which is great. He promises a civilian surge. He doesn't deliver on it, so that's not great. But he also says, hey, we're going to go in, and also, by the way, we're coming home in 18 months. And that undermines all the progress that he's able to achieve. It's a psychologically devastating blow. All of our allies, they start hedging their bets. All of the enemies, they know all they got to do is wait us out, which is exactly what they've done. So for 8 long years, we're in Afghanistan. We're trying to do stuff, and none of it matters because we have these withdrawal deadlines looming over us. Third bad decision was President Trump signing that peace deal with the Taliban, which was not a peace deal. It was a surrender deal, right? He agreed to withdraw, and he did not get any meaningful and enforceable concessions in return from the Taliban. He just gave the farm away. He said, yep, we're going to go, goodbye. And the Taliban were happy to sign that piece of paper. And so the fourth bad decision was, of course, President Biden's choice to just implement that agreement. It was a bad agreement to sign. It's a bad agreement to implement. And I don't understand why he did it. But those 4 decisions I would point to as reasons why it ended the way it ended. It's not all Biden's fault. I think everybody shares blame. But Biden, his decision was the one that we can't undo. The other 3, I was holding on hope that if we just hold on long enough, we can undo our mistakes and get this thing right. The strategy we ended up with by 2014-15, it was not great. I'm not going to defend it as being a very good strategy, but it's better than what we saw last week. And that's what kind of really, gets me angry is that this was the last mistake. We can't undo it. Now it's done. And, that's on Biden.
When you think about how this is, and as you've said, is basically says a lot of bad about our own foreign policy. What does it say about the foreign policy of some of our, frenemies, enemies, China and Russia? And what will they consider? What do they think they will end up doing to maybe have more of a role in that region?
So to go back to that idea of the sort of the fall of Kabul and the decline of world order and how we have lost a step And what that means is the authoritarian powers of the world have more room to maneuver. As we have taken a public humiliating loss and the free world has shrunk, as we've suffered a chink in the armor of the liberal international order, all of that is good news to China and Russia and North Korea and Iran and on and on. So these countries, I'm not sure how directly they will benefit. I think China will. They've already reached out to try to arrange an economic deal with the Taliban. But indirectly, they shine on the world stage a bit better as we shine less, right? That's the zero-sum competition for prestige, and they just got one up on us. That's the main way I think they benefit, in addition to maybe some economic deals for the Chinese.
There is recently was listening to another podcast and listening to Lieutenant General Dan Bolger. And one of the things that he has stressed in his assessment of Afghanistan and Iraq was basically that we shouldn't be places where the people don't like us. That seems to be an odd assessment because, you know, in the last few days, we've heard lots of people, lots of Afghans that seem to like us and like us enough that they're kind of hurt that they are still stuck in Afghanistan. Where do you think, I mean, that thinking is coming from, that somehow people in these countries don't like us, when I think that the truth is actually quite different?
Yeah, when the Afghans are literally clinging to the airplane as it's taxiing down the runway, they plainly see something about America that attracts them, right? They're desperate to come here if they can. And more broadly, you know, I'll quote you polling data about the Afghans and how they support their own constitution, the democratic constitution that they had for the past 20 years. Excuse me. The United States generally had a positive favorability rating for most of the last 20 years. It was rocky because of the civilian casualties and whatnot. But the Afghans, and I'd say people the world over, still like the idea of America. Right. Oftentimes the practice is messier, right? We all know that. But the idea is still very attractive to around the world. And people want to see it made real. And they want to believe in it, and they want to live it. They want to experience it. This idea by this general that, oh, these people just don't like us, is a convenient, simplistic, I'm trying to say this politely. It's very hard to say it politely. I'll say I disagree with that analysis, and I think that what that general is engaging in is othering the Afghans. Right? He's treating them as if they're this alien being out there that we don't fully understand because they're tribal peoples and they're non-Western. And that's just to quote Biden, that's a bunch of malarkey, right? People are people. Nobody likes being oppressed. There's nothing Western about not wanting to be oppressed. And so the problem isn't the Afghans didn't like us. The problem is that the Taliban wanted to kill us. The Taliban don't believe in the things we believe in. Taliban were deeply unpopular in Afghanistan and always have been, but they have bigger guns and they waited us out, and now they won. Now the rest of the Afghans are going to be sort of cowering under their tyranny for who knows how long. It's not because the Afghans didn't like us. It's because the Taliban outweighted us.
And I think something else I've heard from H.R. McMaster is the belief that he thinks that there is a lot of bigotry that is being covered up and cultural sensitivity. And it seems like that's kind of what you're describing here, kind of talking about how different they are, but in reality, that's not very true. And there is a sense of othering.
Yeah, and I was sort of trying to be more polite, but that's right. I think the criticism, the condescension towards the Afghans, the othering is just kind of gross, right? These are people who fought with us for 20 years. They don't like the Taliban. They're fighting against Al-Qaeda, or they wanted to, and we owe them, right? We should accept as many refugees as we can. We owe it to them as a duty, for our own honor, for our own reputation, for our own moral sanity, to be able to look ourselves in the mirror we need to do this. We need to stand by our allies. And so to hear the kind of criticism and also the anti-immigrant sentiment, it's gross. It really is. And I hope that not just President Biden, but I hope there's a bipartisan turning away from that, and that we really kind of reject the nativism and accept our kind of our moral obligation here.
It seems like when we were in the Cold War, there was at least a sense of, I don't want to say unity, but there was a consensus that we were in a certain struggle and we all had to come together. We may disagree on how that is carried out, but there was a belief that the United States was a force for good in the world. We don't sense that the consensus seems to have changed now, that we don't see the U.S. as a force for good, that there are a lot of people that think that we are basically messing up everything. What has changed in the last 30 years that we've gone from such a dramatic shift?
Yeah. Two things that changed was Vietnam and Watergate, right? That changed a lot of people's minds about America. It came to see America on balance, more a force for bad than for good, right? I'll also say, and this gets more into domestic politics, that the culture war started. And started is actually the wrong word, right? Because I think it's always been a feature of American life. I'm finishing up a book now on Christian nationalism. Mm-hmm. And what I found is that we have always argued about the meaning of American identity. And there's always been people who define it in exclusivist terms, whether that's racist or sectarian, religiously sectarian. And there's people who define it in more open terms, I'll put it that way, in civic terms. And today, I feel like the culture war is now a three-sided fight between the nationalists on the one side, and I'll say the progressives on the other. But I don't think the progressives are those who articulate an open vision of American identity, because they're, as you said, kind of anti-American now, right? There's a very small, I hope it's not small, there's a segment of regular, sane Americans who understand what we're supposed to be and what we're supposed to stand for. And we think that both the right and the left have got it wrong. Right? So you're asking me, why don't we have a consensus anymore? It's because of polarization, because of the ongoing culture war, because of the big sort. We now live only in homogenous little enclaves, because we've lost the art of talking together and disagreeing politely. Dennis, you ever heard this adage, don't talk about politics and religion, because I think it's the stupidest thing I ever heard.
It is.
We should talk to people about our deepest beliefs about politics and religion, and we should disagree, and we should learn the art of disagreeing civilly. Mm-hmm. And we would do a lot better as a country if we did that. We should also turn off the TV and stop watching TV news, because it's junk.
I totally agree with you on that last one, especially. I don't know if you heard the speech by the British MP that kind of was talking about everything that had happened. And it was interesting, his speech. I think he was a conservative MP, in how he was talking, because I think the way that he was talking was how these actions affected U.S. standing among our closest allies. So Europe, Japan, Canada. And so that leaves me wondering, does this really put a sense of seeds of doubt among some of our Western closest allies?
I hope not. Again, I can see that argument that this could cause a kind of a collapse of morale within the free world, maybe a domino effect. There's some good scholarship on this after Vietnam. People worried about the same thing. What they found is largely that all politics is local, and that the defeat in Vietnam affected a reputation in Korea, in Japan, in Thailand, but not in Europe, because we face different threats. So the defeat in Afghanistan, I think, is going to seriously affect our relationship with India. And that's really bad, because India, I could go on and on about how the U.S.-India relationship is the great hope of the 21st century, and we've just lost that. I'm not convinced it will affect our relationship with Japan that much. Europe, maybe, because the Europeans were fighting with us, right? It was NATO that was in Afghanistan fighting together with us. And the fact that we collectively lost, that actually may affect our alliance relationship with the Europeans only through that transmission. But I want to be careful. I don't want to overstate the case and say like this one domino will cause the collapse of everything. It's probably not true, but it doesn't have to be true for us to be worried about how bad this is. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, I know that you're fairly busy. I want to just kind of wrap up with one final question: is everything that has happened here this past week obviously has some implications down the road. What do you see? How do you think that this will affect not just American foreign policy, but American society in the next year, 5 years, 10 years down the road?
There's a lot of scenarios, and most of them are bad. There's going to be again, after Vietnam, we were a demoralized nation. And I think that today in the 21st century, we're already demoralized after a year and a half of pandemic, after 4 years of Trump and 40 years of culture war, and after January 6th, right? This is just a deeply divisive, confusing, demoralizing time to be alive and to be American, right? And now we have this. Now we have these images on TV and this international public humiliation. So I think that makes us inclined to think less of our corporate identity as Americans. And that saddens me. It's, I can't. I don't know if I can point to a specific. It's not like GDP will decrease by 0.25%. Like that's not what I'm getting at. It's not that we're going to be poor in that sense, but if our collective identity as Americans it has been humiliated, we all kind of in a sense think less of ourselves and our nation, and that's a very sad thing. Okay, in more practical terms, going forward, there's going to be a fight over the refugees. Already we've seen it in the past few days where the right is playing the nativist card and saying, we don't want to take these refugees. We don't owe them anything. I think that's ugly. I think it's gross, but it's a feature of our politics now where we fight over letting in people who fought with us for so long. So I think that's going to be part of our politics, maybe for the next 3.5 years, right? I think this might actually become a feature in the next presidential election. I hope not, but I think it might. There's going to be some debates about the use of military force after Vietnam. We talked about the Vietnam syndrome, right? And our unwillingness to use the military for the next 15 years until the Gulf War. I kind of think that after Iraq and Afghanistan together, it could be quite some time before we see the need to really exert ourselves in the world in any kind of military way, unless and until we're just directly attacked. Some people might think that's a good thing, right? That we're reluctant to use the military. I just wrote a book on just war theory. I think there's the time and a place to appropriately and justly use military force. And I do think it's important for us to defend the liberal order. And I'm afraid that we'll lack the will, the resources, the belief to do that. And I fear that could be one of the longest, most damaging consequences is that kind of demoralization, sapping our will to defend the free world.
Well, I think it kind of makes sense to say that there are sometimes that you need to, that a just war is more favorable than an unjust peace.
Amen. Yeah. You just summarized my entire book.
Well, thank you, Paul. I know that you have other interviews to do, so thank you for this really engaging time of conversation, and hope to see you and talk to you again soon.
Dennis, thank you so much, and I appreciate your work, and I look forward to talking again.
All right. Well,
all right,
take care. As I said in wrapping up the interview with Paul Miller, there are just wars, and there are or is an unjust peace. There are times that it makes sense to fight, because not fighting could bring dangers that threaten us all. And there are times when peace is something that offers a cessation of hostilities, but that's only for a season. And the forces that you thought would be appeased by laying down their arms come back with a vengeance. I am one that sympathizes with the idea of getting out of Afghanistan. After all, we have been there for 20 years, and many Americans have given their lives. So I totally understand the desire to leave. But I've always thought that if it had to be done, if we had to leave, that would be done with some sense of responsibility. Because if it were done haphazardly, if it were done without thought of the native population, we could doom generations to servitude and threaten the world order. Now, Americans tend to not like to get involved overseas. That is part of of who we are. It's in our DNA. It could be that our geography, being separated by two great oceans, allows us to think that we don't have to get involved with the wider world. We want to think that we can live our lives and not think about what happens in a faraway country on the other side of the globe. And that makes us different from, say, Europe, where nations are so close together. And what happens in places like the Middle East or Africa can affect Germany or France or the United Kingdom. And actually, some commentators believe that Americans don't really follow foreign matters, and our haphazard withdrawal from Afghanistan will be forgotten soon enough. And maybe they're right. Presidents Trump and Biden wanted out of Afghanistan. They wanted it so badly that they were willing to make a deal with the devil, the Taliban, in order to wash their hands of the matter. And for some, that's okay. After all, leaving Afghanistan is a reminder. It is a reminder that it is time to focus on America. Let other nations fend for themselves. So, the forever war is now over. But is the forever war done with us? Because as the Taliban takes over, as Al Qaeda in Afghanistan is reestablished, it's hard to see that what happens in Afghanistan will stay in that corner of the world. No one thought that on September 10th, 2001, terrorists from the other side of the world would come here to attack us. We thought that those mighty oceans protected us, and they did, until they didn't. The American public wanted peace, and I understand that. But our leaders don't have to simply give in to what people want. Leaders are supposed to use sound judgment in determining things like staying or leaving, and to do so in a way that does the least harm to a native population like the Afghans and also protects America from future terrorist attacks. A just peace would mean doing what was needed to help the Afghans have a more stable government and society. Now, we weren't trying to make them Denmark, but something better than the current government. And that we would leave in a way that was orderly and that was respectful of that society. Working for a true peace, a peace that is just, is hard. It means working with stakeholders, and that takes time. In some ways, though, there were people who were on the ground who were already working for that peace. The journalist Jonathan Rauch explains how life had improved for so many Afghans in so many ways over the last 2 decades. Life expectancy increased, mortality dropped. The population was more educated. It was not perfect, it wasn't complete, but peace was happening. But instead, we worked for a cheap peace. We worked with the group that had turned Afghanistan before into some version of the Handmaid's Tale. We didn't care if that meant women would be subjugated again or that gays would be executed. We just didn't want to be involved anymore. So, yes, we got peace, but we got it at a price. because at some point that bill will come due, because illiberal groups like the Taliban or Al Qaeda don't just back off when we leave them alone. As a Christian, I don't think that war should ever be the first choice. I don't think that the military is always the answer or should always be used. That's why I oppose the Iraq War. But there are times when the sword has to be used in order to create a just peace. And over the last 20 years, that was done in Afghanistan, however reluctantly and however imperfectly. I personally believe that Afghanistan was a just war that was trying to create a just peace. Journalist Anne Applebaum reminds us that while we might tire of war, the other side doesn't. She writes, Afghanistan provides a useful reminder that while we and our European allies might be tired of forever wars, the Taliban are not tired of wars at all, she writes. She continues, more to the point, even if we are not interested in any of these nations and their brutal politics, they are interested in us. They see the wealthy societies of America and Europe as obstacles to be cleared out of their way. We got out of Afghanistan. We got peace. But it's an unjust peace. And sooner or later, it will end violently. God help us when it does. Thanks for listening. Make sure to visit our website at enroutepodcast.org, where you can sign up to be on the mailing list for our newsletter, listen to past episodes, and read past articles. You can also, at the website, make a donation to support this podcast. And that's it for this episode of En Route, Notes on Religion, Politics, and Culture. I'm Dennis Sanders, the host. Take care and Godspeed.